January 14th, 1994. South Philadelphia. John Veasey climbs the stairs to an apartment above a neighborhood meat store. By the accounts later given in court, he had been told this was family business, a meeting, maybe finally some of the money he was owed. Inside wait two Stanfa loyalists, Frank Martins and Vincent Pagano, the one they called Al Pajamas. And then Veasey notices the room. Court records and his own testimony describe what he saw. Plastic sheeting, laid out to catch what was about to be spilled. Before he can move, a gun comes up behind his head and fires. Then again. 3 bullets to the head. Another to the chest. A blade goes in 7 times, and John Veasey, by every rule of anatomy and every rule of the Mafia, is a dead man. Except he isn't. He turns on his killers, fights them hand to hand, wounds one of them, and gets down those stairs and out into the street, bleeding from 11 wounds, and still on his feet. The Philadelphia mob has just made the worst mistake in its modern history. It has shown John Veasey the plastic and let him live. Understand who was on those stairs. Veasey was no innocent. He was, by his own sworn confession, a killer twice over, the most violent enforcer of John Stanfa's war against Joey Merlino's young Turks. He was also, though almost nobody knew it yet, already a cooperating government witness. The men with the gun and the knife weren't just committing attempted murder that day. They were trying to erase the case against their boss. They missed. This is the complete story of John Veasey. Not the Netflix version, though. Mob War, Philadelphia versus the Mafia, put his face on screens around the world in October 2025. This is the documented record. How an outsider with no Mafia pedigree became a crime family's deadliest weapon. What he did in August and September of 1993. Why he walked into a federal office and confessed to 2 murders. And how the attempt to silence him turned a hired killer into the witness who buried a boss under 5 consecutive life sentences. But hold one question all the way through, because it's the real subject of this story. What do you do with a man like this? A confessed double murderer who told the whole truth. A victim who was never innocent. A destroyer of the thing he served. John Veasey is the contradiction the justice system runs on, and his story shows you exactly what that bargain costs. He came from the row house blocks of South Philadelphia, and by his own accounts and the court record, he came up hard. Arrests piled up young. He fought constantly and well, drifted through drugs and street work, and built a reputation for one quality above all others. When violence started, John Veasey did not hesitate and did not lose. His brother Billy shared those streets with him, and by John's own later accounts, Billy was the person he stayed closest to through all of it. Remember Billy. This story circles back to him at its darkest point. What John was not, and this matters, was a mob guy. No Sicilian blood, no family pedigree, no years of earning and waiting in a crew. In the ordinary course of Mafia life, a man like Veasey would never get near a made member's table. The war changed the ordinary course. Here's the context in 3 sentences, because this is Veasey's story, not the family's. In 1991, Sicilian-born John Stanfa was installed as boss of a Philadelphia family, shattered by the Scarfo convictions, and a crew of young South Philly rebels led by Joey Merlino and Michael Ciancaglini, called Mikey Chang, refused to recognize him. By early 1993, the dispute over territory and street tribute had become a shooting war, and on March 2nd of that year, just before 6 in the morning, gunmen walked into a Gray's Ferry luncheonette and maimed Stanfa's own underboss, Joseph Ciancaglini Jr., in an attack the FBI's surveillance equipment captured as it happened. One detail from that shooting shadows everything that follows. The wounded underboss was the brother of Mikey Chang, the man on the other side of the war. This family fed its own sons to both armies. Stanfa needed shooters. His imported Sicilians were few, and his made men were old or careful. So the Old World Don did something Old World Dons never do. He went shopping for violence among outsiders. That's how the door opened for John Veasey, brought around in 1993 by men in Stanfa's orbit who knew exactly what he was good at, and put to work for wages he later described in court as a few $100s a week. Measure that against the organization he was killing for. Court records from the era describe the family's street tribute running from hundreds into thousands of dollars a month from a single bookmaker. The war was being fought over that money. The man fighting it was getting almost none of it. Keep that arithmetic in mind. It gets more important every minute of this story. What Veasey did for that money is settled fact, because he confessed to all of it under oath. On August 5th, 1993, in the early afternoon, Veasey and a second gunman, Philip Coletti, ambushed Merlino and Mikey Chang as the two walked near 6th and Catherine Streets in the heart of their own neighborhood. The shooters opened fire at close range in broad daylight. Mikey Chang, 30 years old, was hit in the chest and died. Merlino went down, wounded, and survived. The two gunmen fled the scene, and the cleanup that followed would itself become evidence, because in time even Philip Coletti's wife told the government what she knew. It was the single most consequential act of the entire war. The rival faction's leadership cut in half on a residential corner, and one of the men pulling triggers was a street fighter. The Mafia rulebook said, should never have been there. And the reward? By Veasey's account, the payoff for the war's biggest killing never fully arrived. The exact figures were never established in public, but the grievance was, repeated under oath, a debt the family never intended to pay. Prosecutors would spend years charging the war's other violence to the Merlino side, and juries would acquit Merlino of all of it. This killing needed no such fight. Both gunmen stood up in court and owned it. Stanfa's side wasn't finished with him. In September 1993, a man named Frank Baldino Sr., counted by the Stanfa faction as an enemy, was shot to death in his car outside the Melrose Diner in South Philadelphia. Veasey confessed to that murder, too. 2 killings in 6 weeks. And here is where the government's file on John Veasey started building without his knowledge, because the FBI was watching the Stanfa organization from the outside. And among the evidence investigators later put forward was surveillance photography connecting Veasey directly to Stanfa's circle. Think about what that image meant. The boss who ruled through layers and old country caution, tied by the government's own camera to the outsider who did his shooting. The Don's deniability had a photograph problem. Inside the family, Veasey's stock had never been higher. By accounts that later reached courtrooms, Stanfa formally initiated him into the family in the fall of 1993, an astonishing elevation for a non-Sicilian street fighter, and a measure of how badly the war had bent the old rules. That was the peak. A street fighter from outside the bloodline, made in wartime, useful and feared in equal measure. Now watch how fast the same organization turned its weapon around, because this next stretch, October 1993 to January 1994, is the hinge of the entire story. The relationship rotted over 2 things: money and fear. The money was simple. Veasey had done the family's bloodiest work and stayed on wages he described as a few $100s a week, with rewards, he says, were promised and never fully arrived. The fear was more dangerous. To Stanfa's inner circle, the volatile outsider now knew everything, and everything he knew he could say. A weapon that talks is a liability. Veasey read the temperature drop. And by his own account, he also understood his legal exposure was total: 2 murders, a war's worth of violence, and a boss who would not spend a nickel protecting him. So in early January 1994, John Veasey made the decision that defines his life. He went to federal authorities, confessed to the murders of Michael Ciancaglini and Frank Baldino, and signed on as a cooperating witness against John Stanfa. Understand what that confession actually was, because this is how these deals work. A cooperator doesn't get to trade half the truth. The agreement demands everything, every crime, admitted in full, and if the government catches a single lie, the deal dies and every admission stays on the record against him. Veasey handed them the Baldino murder along with the Ciancaglini murder, closing a case with his own name. From the moment he signed, his only protection was total honesty. It turned out to be the one weapon nobody in this story could take from him. Here's the insider reality of that moment, and it's the part most documentaries skip. A brand new cooperation deal is a secret, and it has to stay one, because the moment it surfaces, the case's other targets scatter and the witness becomes a target. But secrecy cuts the other way, too. There was no protection detail on John Veasey in the second week of January 1994. The government's newest witness was walking around South Philadelphia, still playing the role of Stanfa's soldier, guarded by nothing but his own nerve. The FBI had the confession. Stanfa's circle had the suspicion, and on January 14th, the suspicion moved first. But that's not the crazy part. The crazy part is that when the Stanfa organization finally moved to erase John Veasey, the confession was already signed. They weren't killing a risk. They were killing a witness who had already testified to paper. That's the room above the meat store. The pretext that brought him up those stairs was family business. The plastic on the surfaces told him the truth, a second too late. Frank Martins and Vincent Pagano attacked, and the record of what followed reads like, "It can't be real. 3 gunshots to the head, 1 to the chest, 7 stab wounds." And a man who took all of it and fought anyway, wounding one of his attackers in the struggle, forcing his way out of the apartment and into the street, where he survived to reach a hospital. Witnesses described him reaching the street conscious and fighting to stay that way until help came. He survived surgery, and from his hospital bed the secret ended. The government moved its witness beyond the family's reach for good. Doctors and prosecutors would later walk juries through the wounds. Both attackers, Martins and Pagano, were eventually convicted for the attempt, and the organization that ordered the plastic laid down had accomplished exactly one thing. It had converted a compromised witness into an avenging one, and handed the government a walking, talking exhibit of what the Stanfa family did to its own. What happened next moved with the speed of a case that was already built. Philip Coletti, the second gunman from the August ambush, cut his own deal and corroborated the story from a second angle. The FBI already held its most extraordinary evidence, hundreds of hours from a court-authorized bug hidden inside the Camden Law Office, where Stanfa held his most sensitive meetings. The boss's own voice working through murder plots. Some of it in Sicilian dialect the Bureau had to translate for court, tapes from the fortress room, confessions from both shooters, photographs tying the muscle to the Don. On March 17, 1994, St. Patrick's Day, federal agents arrested John Stanfa and swept up more than 20 members and associates of his faction. The war was over. The trial would decide who had won it. And the war reached into that trial with one last killing. On the morning of October 5, 1995, the day John Veasey was expected to begin his testimony, his brother Billy, who was not a participant in the war, was shot dead in his vehicle on his way to work in South Philadelphia. Be careful here, because the record demands it. Prosecutors years later charged that murder to Merlino associates, alleging it was meant as a message, and a jury acquitted. Others have pointed toward Stanfa loyalists with everything to lose from John's testimony. Each theory had its own logic. The Merlino side had lost Mikey Chang to John Veasey's gun. The Stanfa side was about to lose everything to John Veasey's mouth. The accounts differ. No theory has ever been proven in any courtroom, and the murder of Billy Veasey remains officially unsolved. What is documented is its intended effect and its actual one. If the bullet was meant to silence John Veasey, it did the opposite. He buried his brother, and then he took the stand. The defense strategy wrote itself. Paint the witness as what he was, a confessed double murderer with a violent record, testifying for a discount. It failed, and it failed for a reason worth understanding. The testimony became Philadelphia legend. Veasey made no excuses and offered no polish. He owned both murders in plain language, described the war from inside the trigger, walked the jury through the room with the plastic, and carried his own wounds into court as evidence no defense attorney could cross-examine away. Jurors were looking at a man the defendant's organization had shot in the head 3 times, and he was still talking. On November 21st, 1995, the jury convicted John Stanfa across the board. 33 federal counts: racketeering, murder conspiracy, kidnapping conspiracy, the full architecture of his reign. The court sentenced him to 5 consecutive life terms. His faction collapsed into guilty pleas and long sentences around him. The bricklayer from Sicily, who had survived the murder of Angelo Bruno in his own car 14 years earlier, would die in federal custody as a matter of arithmetic. He remains inside today, in his 80s. Then it was Veasey's turn to be sentenced, because cooperation is a discount, not a pardon. For the murders of Michael Ciancaglini and Frank Baldino, under the terms of his agreement, John Veasey received 10 years. Sit with that number honestly, because this story doesn't work if you look away from it. 2 men were dead. Their families got a decade, served by a witness the government needed. Mikey Chang's family heard the man who shot him explain it from a witness stand, and then watched him walk into the Witness Protection Program with a new name and a second life. That is the machinery of every major mafia prosecution in America. Cases against the top bought with mercy for the trigger, and the Stanfa case is one of the clearest looks the public has ever gotten at its price. You don't have to like the bargain. The government would tell you, and the verdict sheet backs them, that without it, John Stanfa dies a free man. Veasey served his time, disappeared into witness protection, and rebuilt somewhere far from South Philadelphia. In the years since, in interviews and finally on camera for Netflix in 2025, he has described the life he built after: work, family, faith, and what he calls redemption. Present that claim exactly as it is, his claim. Some who lost people to the war will never accept it, and they don't owe him acceptance. What can be said from the record is narrower and stranger. The man the Philadelphia Mafia tried hardest to kill is one of the only figures from the entire war who is alive, free, and talking. When Mob War premiered on Netflix on October 22, 2025, 3 episodes built on the case's tapes, photographs, and survivors, Veasey sat for the cameras under his own face and told the story you've just heard, scars and all. Stanfa is in a cell for life. Mikey Chang and Billy Veasey are in the ground. Martins and Pagano were convicted for the meat store attack. Merlino, acquitted of every murder charge prosecutors ever brought from the war, runs his own public second act. And John Veasey, 3 bullets to the head and 7 wounds from a blade later, gave Netflix the interview. So what does this specific story reveal? That the Mafia's most dangerous enemy was never the FBI. It was its own personnel policy. Stanfa reached outside the family for a weapon because the war demanded it, then underpaid, insulted, and finally tried to destroy that weapon because the culture demanded that too. Every step was tradition. Every step built the witness. The bug in the law office gave the government Stanfa's voice, but it was the plastic in that apartment that gave the government its case's beating heart. A killer with nothing left to protect and 11 wounds worth of reasons. Organizations that treat loyalty as free and violence as disposable eventually meet the one man who survives the disposal. Philadelphia met him on January 14, 1994. John Veasey was a murderer by his own oath, a victim by his own scars, and a truth-teller by the government's own verdicts, all 3 at once, no version canceling the others. The Philadelphia Mafia had one job that day above the meat store, and its failure wrote the ending of its own story. They laid out the plastic for John Veasey. He climbed down the stairs, and he buried the boss instead. If this story grabbed you, hit subscribe. We drop a new mob documentary every week. And drop a comment. After Veasey's side of the war, whose story should we tell next?